So today we're going to be talking about some basic cadences that you're going to encounter quite frequently in the classical and romantic periods, and we're also going to talk a little bit about voice leading. These are some very important concepts. The cadences you're going to learn today are going to be used over and over again, so it's really important that even though this is a short lecture, this is one lecture that you really want to spend your time on and really fully understand how to resolve all of your basic chords. Because again, this is going to come back again and again. When we start talking about secondary dominants, you're going to have the same basic voice leading rules with some minor exceptions that are essentially similar to what you're learning right now. So it's kind of like killing two birds with one stone if you really understand this lecture. So the first thing you need to know is the difference between an authentic and a half cadence. There's basically three types of authentic cadences, and they're listed in order on this page from the most conclusive to the least conclusive. So your first one would be the perfect authentic cadence. We've talked about this a little bit, but this is where you have a 5-1 chord, where you have 5-1 motion in the bass, and that's referring to the scale degrees, so scale degree 5 in the bass, moving to scale degree 1. As you can see right here in this image, you've got the 5th scale degree of C, which is G, and it just resolves to 1 in the bass. The other thing that makes it perfect authentic as opposed to imperfect or contrapuntal is the soprano line. So the soprano line moves by step into scale degree 1, like you see in both of these perfect authentic cadences, then you know you're dealing with a perfect authentic cadence. If it's not scale degree 1 in the soprano, or you don't have this scale degree 5 to scale degree 1 in the bass, then it's not a perfect authentic cadence. But as long as you have a 5-1 chord, if you look at all of these, the perfect authentic, it moves from 5 to 1, imperfect authentic, in this case we have a 5-7 to 1, and the contrapuntal imperfect authentic, it's a 5-6 to 1. So all of our authentic cadences use this 5-1 chord progression. It just depends on how they're voiced that makes them stronger or weaker. Or you can think of it as perfect, imperfect, or contrapuntal. So the important thing about the perfect authentic cadence is that if scale degree 1 isn't approached by step, then you have to apply some context to determine whether or not it's a perfect authentic cadence. There's a few instances where Mozart will have sort of a half beat break between the 7th scale degree and the 1st scale degree in the soprano, and some theorists will argue, well, is it really a perfect authentic cadence if it doesn't connect directly into the 1 chord? It just depends on how you hear it. So it's very important to also listen to the melody. If it sounds like a perfect authentic cadence, if it sounds like the phrase comes to a close, then you could probably justify calling it a perfect authentic cadence. So if we look at the imperfect authentic cadence, that's just a little less perfect than the perfect, right? It's just a little imperfect. Notice in this example, I only have one. Scale degree 3 is in the soprano. It's still approached by step, and that naturally happens because we tend to want to use stepwise motion, but it's still a perfect authentic cadence because you have the 5-1 motion, and then this just stepwise motion into a 3rd instead of scale degree 1 in the soprano. That makes it an imperfect authentic cadence. So we still have this 5-1 motion in the bass and scale degree 3, or I don't have an example of it, but scale degree 5 in the soprano would make it imperfect authentic. So that's the only difference between perfect and imperfect. With perfect, you've got scale degree 1 in the soprano. With imperfect, it's scale degree 3 or 5. So then the contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence. The reason we call this contrapuntal is because the bottom voice moves by step. And 5-6 to 1 is going to be the most common when dealing with triads for the contrapuntal. But you could also have a 5-4-3 going to a 1, or even a 5-4-2 going to a 1-6. All of these would be considered contrapuntal cadences. The thing that makes it contrapuntal is the stepwise motion in the bass. So if you have a 5-1 progression at the end of a phrase and you see this stepwise motion occurring in the bass, then you know you're dealing with a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence. Notice this one, it moves from a D to a C. So that's a lot like our second measure perfect authentic cadence. So we'd call this one a strong imperfect authentic cadence if you want to further classify this, because it has that strong motion in the soprano even though the bass has been weakened by that inversion. So half cadences are the final type of cadence we're going to be talking about today. That's where you move from any chord to 5. So these two chords here, in our last two measures, we have a 1 chord going to a 5 chord. And you'll see they're voiced in different ways. Notice how this one actually skips up a third. That happens sometimes with the half cadence. It's one of the things that you can do. It'll be the first time where you should actually be able to create a chord progression where you skip. Generally, the only voice that skips is the bass. Notice how in all three of these progressions, the first three, we're moving by step in the upper voices, or we're keeping the common tone the same. Moving by step, here's an example of skipping into a third. So this is also acceptable, but then both voices have to skip. This is a little bit less desirable, but you can do this. Typically, you want to go for the shortest motion, like you see in this first chord. The imperfect authentic cadence, we also have a skip, but you could move by step or keep the common tone when you don't have a 5/7 chord. So one of the reasons this one's skipping is because it's a 5/7 moving to 1, and we'll talk more about how to actually resolve 5/7 to 1 later. Right now, you just understand the concept of perfect authentic, imperfect authentic, contrapuntal imperfect authentic, and the half cadence. So while these are moving from 1 to 5, it could be moving from any chord to 5. You could have a 2 to 5. You could have a 4 to 5. You could have a 6 to 5. These are all half cadences because they end on the 5 chord. So when you label a cadence, it's important that it comes at the end of a phrase. It's not a cadence if it doesn't come at the end of the phrase. So when it's not at the end of a phrase, we typically call it a resolution or an expansion of a tonal area instead of a cadence. So a 5/1 chord that just occurs as part of the tonic area is just sort of a dominant tonic resolution. So that term's going to come up again, and it'll actually make more sense as I show it to you in context. So the important thing here is that to label a cadence, it requires context. You can't just simply go through and complete a harmonic analysis. You also have to look at what's going on in the melody. So you have to take the phrase into account, you have to take into account what the piece sounds like, and there's a lot of factors that go into play besides just the harmonic analysis. 9 times out of 10, with a classical period piece by a famous composer, the most popular ones like Mozart, Haydn, even Beethoven, they are going to use fairly straightforward chord progressions that will indicate the end of a phrase. But there's always going to be exceptions where you have to dig deeper and you have to look at the melody as well. You have to look at the motives. You have to look at what's going on in the piece as a whole to really determine how each phrase ends. So that's something you're going to learn to do as we continue through this course. One thing that's important before we get into writing chord progressions is your choral vocal ranges. So these are the most commonly used vocal ranges. They may vary by about a major second depending on the textbook you're looking at, but these are pretty standard vocal ranges. So when you write a 4-part progression, you want to have a soprano voice, an alto, a tenor, and a bass, because we're really writing for choir when we talk about music theory. It's not so much music theory for instrumentalists. We start with the basic choir understanding because that's simple to write for, and then once you learn how to write for choir, the idea is that you can then expand it out to other instruments. So we try and keep our upper voice between the C4 and G5, the alto between the G3 and D5, tenor between C3 and G4, and bass between E2 and D4. So you wouldn't really want to have a bass note that has a G4. That would be better given to the tenor, because these are all the ranges that are most easy for singers to perform. So here's some basic guidelines for writing your 4-part harmonies. You want to use close position. whenever possible. So that would be the upper three voices are as close together as possible. And this basically means no notes can be inserted between the soprano and the alto, or the alto and the tenor. Between the bass and the tenor, you have a little more leeway. You can have up to an octave and a maximum of a 12th between the bass and the tenor voice. Another type of spacing would be called open position. So that's when a chord member can be inserted between one or more of the upper three voices. So when using open spacing, it's important to keep the distance between chord members approximately the same. So if you had, let's say, a third in the bass, or between the tenor and the alto, and then you had a sixth between the alto and the soprano, it wouldn't be even spacing. You want to keep it more to like a fifth or a sixth between each voice. You want to keep the spacing somewhat the same. Either spacing's fine. It's not that one is necessarily preferred, but it will depend on context. So if you want a really tight harmony, close position will give you a better sound that projects. Open spacing is going to give you a lighter sound. So it really just depends on what you're going for as a composer. And I talk about this more in the musical course, so that's why I'm going over this very briefly, because this should just be a review of previous concepts. So here's some voicing that you need to avoid. In the first example, we have what we call crossed voices. So if you'll notice, the tenor voice is on a G4, and then you have the alto, which is actually an E4, right? So the G4 is actually higher than the alto. So since the tenor is higher than the alto voice, we call that cross voices. So cross voices occurs between a single chord, and you want to avoid that because you want to keep each vocal register in its own space. You don't want to cross over into another voice's territory. The next example, so let's just show you real quick. So here's a G4 and there's the E4. That G4 would actually be right here where my cursor is, so it's above this E4. So you want to avoid that. You'd have to switch these voices around. So maybe the alto would do the G4, and then the tenor would do this E down here. Same notes, it's just we respaced it to make it fit each voice and avoid that crossing. So the next thing is voice overlapping. So notice how you have the alto jumping up to this D. That D is actually higher than the soprano's previous note. So this is voice overlapping because this D is overlapping with the previous note. You want to avoid that. What is okay is unisons. So you could have the alto jump up to the same note as the soprano because it's not overlapping at this point. It's actually just the same pitch, and this is better than this. This should still be avoided if possible, but sometimes you want to take the melody and you want to make it higher, and then the alto voice will become too far away from the soprano. So this is a way of getting around that. You can use this same note, the unison, and avoid the voice overlapping. So those are two terms that you kind of need to learn, and you've got to watch out for kind of the difference between cross voices and voice overlapping. It can be a little bit confusing. So here are doubling guidelines. The doubling rules can change based on the context or the chord progression. Use the doubling that results in the smoothest voice leading and avoids faulty motion. So the first thing you want to do is you don't want to double any tendency tones or notes with accidentals. So if you see an accidental, you can't double that note because it's out of the key, so it already stands out. A tendency tone has a tendency to resolve a particular way. So like the leading tone wants to resolve up, or the seventh of a chord wants to resolve down. These are already tendency tones. They already have a strong pull towards a certain note. So you don't want to double those, because if you did, you'd have to resolve those correctly. Let's say you double the leading tone. Then you'd have to resolve both leading tones up. And that would actually create parallel octaves, something I can show you later. You also ideally want to double the bass and root position chords. If you want the most stable sounding chord, you could also double the bass and the soprano voice. So you'd have typically scale degree 1 or 5, depending on what chord you're dealing with, in the soprano. So that's just if you want the most stable sound. Whatever note you have in the bass doubled in the soprano. That's That's a good rule of thumb for root position chords. You can also double any chord member in first inversion as long as rule number 1 is not violated. So if you have an accidental, let's say you have a first inversion triad and the bass note is an A sharp, you can't double that A sharp if it doesn't fit the key. So just pay attention to that first rule and you can double any chord member in first inversion. For second inversion, we want to double the bass, and the reason for that is typically in second inversion, the only time you're going to see those would be maybe with a diminished triad or maybe with a cadential 6/4. You typically just want to double the bass for those second inversion triads. The last one, the diminished triad, they usually appear in first inversion, so you should double the bass note. If you double the root of a diminished triad, here's a diminished triad, you got, then between the root and the fifth is a tritone. So if you double that root, then you are emphasizing the tritone. So by doubling the third, here's a third that's doubled, here's a root. The root is just a little more dissonant sounding. Doubling the third, which is what I'm doing now, helps to reduce some of that dissonance, so that's a better way to actually do it. So if you can't double the bass and it's not in first inversion for some reason, then you want to choose the smoothest voice leading that resolves that root and fifth inward to a third, or if it's voiced a different way, you might have an augmented fourth, so that augmented fourth would resolve outward to a sixth. If any of that's confusing, this becomes more clear with practice. So I have some construction videos that you can watch after this that will actually help you to learn how to resolve all these different chords. Okay, so here are the basic rules. For resolving 5-1, I have several examples of different voicings you can use. Anytime you see 3 flats, it's in C minor. So what I've done here is I've shown you how to do major and minor. Notice between major and minor, the resolutions are exactly the same. They don't change. The only difference is this B needs to become a B natural. So you always have to raise that leading tone. So B is a 7th scale degree of C. So make sure in minor you always have that leading tone. If you don't have that leading tone, it's just not going to have that pull that we want towards the tonic. So always resolve the leading tone to the tonic. In minor, you need to raise the 7th to actually create the leading tone. Keep the common tone whenever possible. Look at all of these. Common tone, common tone, common tone, common tone, common tone, common tone. Look at the leading tone. Leading tone resolves, leading tone resolves. Leading tones in the bass, it's resolved by the nature of the chord progression. Leading tone resolves, leading tones resolving, leading tones resolving. You want to avoid parallel and contrary octaves and fifths, so that's where you move from an octave into an octave or a fifth into a fifth. If you see 8-8 between any of the voices, you need to double check, make sure you didn't do anything wrong, because you've got to avoid those. And you need to also avoid melodic intervals that are hard to sing. So the augmented 2nd, augmented 4th, and diminished 5th, those will occur, but it's not really going to happen right now with your 5-1 cadences. This is more of a general voice leading guideline that comes into play later on. You also want to avoid direct octaves and fifths. So direct octaves and fifths are when you move maybe from like an interval of a 6 upwards into an interval of a 5th, or downwards into an interval of a 5th. So when you use similar motion into a 5th or an octave, that would be a hidden octave or 5th. It's hidden, sometimes called direct, because you don't actually see octave to octave motion or 5th to 5th motion. It's from some other interval, like a 6th into a 5th. So when the soprano and bass move in similar motion into a perfect octave or 5th, you could have direct octaves or fifths. So direct octaves and fifths are going to be allowed in the inner voices. So that's one way you can get away with them. And this is really a rule that specifically applies to 4-part counterpoint and 4-part harmony. And direct octaves are allowed if the soprano moves down by step. So that's another way you can get away with direct octaves. So let's say, look at this. We have a G moving into a C. Let's see if we have any examples. There are no examples because these chord progressions are written a little bit too well. But let's say this first chord, this G, moved up to a C. Then what you'd have is you'd have an octave between the bass and the soprano. So we've got that C there. So that would be technically this B going to the C and then the G moving in similar motion up to the C. That'd be direct motion into an octave. But we're allowed to get away with it if the upper voice moves by step. So that's really the only place where you have to watch for direct octaves is between the outer voices. And as long as the soprano moves by step, you'll avoid the issue of direct or hidden octaves. Okay, so that's it. Next week we're going to be talking about, or in the next lecture, we'll talk about 7 chord resolutions and tendency tones. Now, go on to watch the chord construction videos so that you can see how we actually resolve these chords. I'll take you step by step through it.